Aloha, and welcome to an Introduction to Language. This presentation, though a bit theoretical and dense, provides information on language and language learning, introduces some practical concepts, and overall aims to help you establish a conceptual framework for your language learning journey. The big question is, what even is language? It's a historical, cultural, and social tool and resource, originating long ago and ever-changing over time, adapted and used for present contexts and purposes. It's used to represent the world, people, things, events, activities and actions, thoughts and feelings, and more. It's used to communicate, coordinate, and collaborate with each other. It's used to pass down and accumulate wisdom, knowledge, and practices. And perhaps most essentially, it's used to connect with each other. Unlike many areas of studies, it is not an analytical target, an end, a product, a puzzle, or a game. It is a quintessential human activity, a means, a process, and a dynamic tool and resource for navigating and shaping our worlds, our daily social lives, our relationships, and ourselves, and for making meaning therein. Imagine a day without any language whatsoever. You don't encounter any language. You don't see, read, or hear any words, and you don't utter any words either. No movies or shows, no videos or clips, no posts, no comments, no signs, no menus, no music, no conversations. In other words, no reading, no writing, no listening, and no speaking. Just silence. As humans, language is the air we breathe and makes all else possible. The use of language is, at its core, the interaction between agent and environments. Said interaction is multidimensional, multifaceted, and multimodal. In this sense, it involves a dynamic range of areas and aspects. It involves the interaction of societies, cultures, communities, and groups, peoples, relationships, identities, and voices, values, beliefs, and practices, as well as genres, contexts, situations, styles, norms, expectations, variations, and deviations. It also involves thoughts and feelings, and motivations and goals. The interaction of the above areas and aspects all contribute to languaging, an ongoing and dynamic process of using language. The use of language can also be thought of in terms of levels. A macro level of ideologies, beliefs, and values, a meso level of institutions and communities, and a micro level of social activities and interactions. What's interesting is that these levels not only influence one's use of language, but our use of language also reflexively influence the levels, whether through maintaining normative usage or innovating creative new usage. It's a dynamic, ongoing, co-occurring dance. Since these levels are somewhat abstract, let's break them down into more concrete and practical concepts we should keep in mind. First, context. It frames everything we do and say. Of course, we have larger scale contexts of society and culture, but on a more local and immediate scale are the social situation one is in, the social activity going on, and the people involved in it. Second, one's goal or objective. Within a context, situation, activity, everything is guided by some sort of goal or objective. We can think of this as one's contextual, situational, activity-based motivation. It may be at the front of one's mind, or more subconscious, and range from getting some sort of information to simply building rapport with someone. With this goal or objective in mind, everything else acts as a means to support it. Third, interactional elements. Within a given context, situation, activity, with one's goal, objective, interaction entails many elements. To start, sequences of talk, which focus on certain conversational aims, such as starting the conversation, setting up an idea, making a counterpoint, addressing misunderstandings, etc. And of course, closing the conversation. Within each sequence, there are certain actions, interactional and communicative actions, being undertaken turn by turn to move things along, For instance, asking a question, providing a response, asking a follow-up question, elaborating, and so on. To accomplish these actions, there are a whole range of linguistic and pragmatic resources being drawn on and put to use. The last concept to keep in mind is multimodality. Simply put, interaction entails vocal modes and embodied modes. This means one's speech itself and the tone or tones one says something in, as well as one's facial and body gestures when saying or responding to something. In all, language involves a wide and colorful array of levels and aspects. Now that we've discussed what language is, what about language learning? As with language, it's not an object, fixed and unchanging. Learning is a process, and a gradual one at that. A process that's multidimensional, intricate, dynamic, and evolving. It involves study on the one hand, and exposure and use on the other. Study is that of grammatical structures, forms, and rules, and of sayings, phrases, vocabulary, etc. Things that form discrete knowledge. Exposure and use is to various social, cultural, and interactional contexts and elements over time. Processes that form integrated applications. Whereas study creates awareness and a foundation, exposure and use develop naturalness and nuance. In other words, whereas study is to know and understand the language, exposure and use is to feel and live the language. Think of it this way. If you've never studied, heard, or seen something, how can you know of it? And if you've never studied, heard, or seen it in various and dynamic contexts, how can you know how to use it? With language learning, the goal is not to memorize and repeat, to learn about the language, to know everything, because you can't. The goal is to think and apply, to learn how to use and to actually use the language, to develop new ways of conceptualizing the world, and thus new ways of seeing the world. The goal is to develop socially, culturally, contextually attuned repertoires of interactional resources, to participate in, navigate, and shape various activities and situations and the world. A handy metaphor for what language learning is that of a bucket versus clouds. Imagine a bucket, your head, with stuff being put into it. It's overly simplistic, stagnant, and water leaks out too. Your head is not a bucket. The brain and learning are much more complex and interesting. Now, imagine a sky, your mind, with clouds, ideas and concepts. At the beginning of education, your sky has few layers and only sparse clouds, with simple shapes and colors. But as you learn and develop, your sky becomes more complex and dynamic, with multiple layers and countless clouds of various shapes, sizes, colors, swirling, changing, interacting, and growing. The difference between a lower mind, a kid, and a higher mind, a mature intellectual adult, is not about the amount of stuff, but rather the complexity, dynamicity, and colorfulness of abstract and interacting ideas and concepts. The process of learning is about creating or finding a sense of meaning and purpose. It's essential. We thrive when something is relevant, practical, and of use to us. So think of your life, your aspirations, whether long-term, short-term, or everyday hopes. It's from this sense of meaning and purpose that comes motivation and engagement. Set, or at least be aware of, the goal or objective. In a given context, situation, activity, a clear goal or objective will help to align interactional sequences, actions, and resources. You also have to immerse and engage. Learning is experiential and multimodal, which is to say, we're all VARK learners, visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic, all in one. Sure, some people may be better at spatial recognition or tone recognition and may prefer one over the other, and certain areas like geography or music, and certain concepts themselves, may lend themselves more easily to a certain mode, but our brain takes advantage of and weaves together every input as it attempts to get at meaning and learn something. In other words, we all learn best when using all modalities together. And we can also actively apply strategies as well, like mnemonics or stories. A key concept is that we learn less by rote studying and more by actually doing something. In other words, not about an activity, but in and through an activity. Participation precedes learning. For instance, riding a bike. I could tell you all the mechanics and physics behind it, but in the end, you have to get on the bike and ride. You might think of it as content and knowledge surpassed by skills and capacities. What use is knowing everything if you can't use it? So use the language, get talking, just like you do every day. With the above idea, the key is then to practice, practice, practice. It should obviously be at an appropriate level of challenge. It shouldn't be so easy, so you can already do it, but shouldn't be so hard that you can't do or learn anything. When practicing, you also want iterations, trying something several times for it to sink in, and variations, so you can handle slight deviations and different nuances. These iterations and variations can pertain to situations, scenarios, goals, roles and identities, positions and stances, actions, or voices. Overall, this practice provides opportunities for pattern recognition, as well as learning how to navigate natural, open conversations. As you practice, you can think, what do I want to say, and how do I want to say it? Via a Japanese mindset and perspective, and via the Japanese language. One major thing to also remember is that you're a language user and a language learner. As an adult, you're not a blank slate starting from scratch. You have your native language and worldly, universal experiences, knowledge, skills, whether interactional, analytical, or interpretive, strategies, competencies, and intuitions. So put them all to use. The process of learning is dialogic and collaborative. Contextualized social interaction is where learning and development primarily occur. That is, we learn and develop most when in concrete contexts and when interacting with others, whether through their written words or spoken words. Given a goal and in its pursuit being faced with a problem, for instance, not knowing how to do something or say something, we often engage in interpersonal and discussive mediation and guidance, getting help or inspiration, a step up where we need it. In sum, it amounts to the difference between what one can accomplish on one's own versus what one can accomplish with assistance, with the latter almost always accomplishing much more. In this sense, learning is very much about the shift of control and autonomy. A useful little quote to think of is, I do, we do, you do. Wherein, over time, you shift from observing and requiring lots of support to doing more and more on your own with less and less support until you are independent and autonomous. One last slide on the process of learning, specifically with some useful take-home metaphors and concepts. First, self-determination. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Meaning, the teacher can guide you, give you exposure information and explanations, but in the end, your learning is in your hands. A main goal of education in class is for you to become an autonomous learner. A similar quote states, the teacher can open the door, but the student has to walk through it. Second, slow sand. Obviously, quicksand is bad and you don't want to sink, but slow sand is language. You want to get to the bottom of it, to be surrounded by it. But if you always hold on to a support, a branch or a rope, you'll never get anywhere. If you wiggle a little, you slowly settle in. And if you really struggle and work at it, you'll be immersed in it that much sooner. But learning a language is a struggle and does take time. Japanese, for instance, according to the US Department of State, is one of the hardest languages for native English speakers to learn. The difficulty is reflected in the time it takes to reach professional working proficiency, which is ranked into easy, medium, hard, and very hard languages. Whereas Spanish takes about 600 class hours, Japanese takes about 2,200 class hours. You could learn Spanish almost 4 times by the time you learn Japanese once. So, as you embark on your Japanese learning journey, know, even 101, your beginning level class, is not something to take lightly. To learn Japanese will be a struggle and will take time, but the results are certainly worth it. Third, hunger and roller coaster. When it comes to learning a language, or anything really, you have to have an appetite, a motivation for it. But nothing is ever a completely stable, straight path. And like waves of hunger and roller coasters, there's ups and downs, whether it be in your motivation, your cognitive thinking processes, and or your emotional and psychological states. And these could depend on the teacher, your classmates, the topics, the materials themselves, your mood, or other priorities you have at a given time. We're human, and that's life. Sometimes you just do what you can, go with the flow and ride it out until you get back in the groove. Overall, if you expect life and language learning to be a stable path, the bumps will throw you off and make you more upset because they deviate from your expectations. But if you expect things to get bumpy sometimes, as they naturally do, you'll be able to better manage and get through it smoother and more effectively. This all ties into the next point. Fourth, a growth mindset. When faced with challenges, there's two different mindsets one may have. On one hand is a set, fixed mindset, wherein someone feels they have it or they don't, expects immediate results, gives up quickly after a single failed try, and chalks things up to luck and fate. On the other hand is a growth mindset, wherein someone knows that development is gradual and takes time, keeps trying until they figure it out, and realizes with dedication, persistence, and effort, they can get better. What one chooses to believe is often what one becomes. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, choose to see your ability not as set and fixed, but as effort-based and developing. Lastly, the U-shape of learning and development. Unlike what most people think, learning and development is not a straight diagonal line up. It's a U-shape. Given a topic, at first you get the basics and go up, but then you get into the complexities and nuances and go way down. After a while of study and practice, though, you gradually gain more and more control over those complexities and nuances and go up. And finally, you go beyond, mastering it and using it creatively. While learning an additional language certainly isn't easy, the benefits are many. One central benefit is brain growth, which provides advantages for learning, career, and health, from higher cognition, higher test scores, and superior life skills, to better college success, stronger employability, and higher earnings, to a healthier brain that recovers better and stays young longer. On top of that, learning an additional language opens your door to the world, to international travel, to international art, literature, music, shows, and film, and broadly, to other societies, cultures, communities, and people. It strengthens your social, emotional, and personal development, and it opens your mind to new conceptualizations of the world and ways of seeing everything in it. With so many benefits, learning an additional language can have wonderfully positive impacts throughout your life. We'll wrap up our introduction to language with some summative take-home quotes. As quoted in the Harry Potter series by Dumbledore, words are our most inexhaustible source of magic. Understanding language helps us better understand how people think, how they make sense of the world and each other, and how they communicate. Our learning is defined not by the development of a well-constructed model of language, but rather by the development of language as a resource for participation in the activities of everyday life. We do and are therefore able to learn, and equally, we learn and are therefore able to do more. To learn a language is to embark on a journey. So, get ready to traverse various landscapes. Keep your feet on the ground and take it one step at a time, and enjoy the adventure.